Welcome everyone to Loop Junior's first webinar, Rethinking Risk, Are Children Too Safe for Their Own Good? My name is Mariel Ang, and I am the project coordinator at the Ontario Neurotrauma Foundation. ONF sponsors the Loop Junior Childhood Fall Prevention Community of Practice. Loop Junior is a place where childhood fall prevention practitioners connect. Visit us at www.jr.fallsloop.com. Marguerite Thomas also joins us on the line. Marguerite is the liaison for the Fall Prevention Community of Practice. She will be assisting with facilitating questions in the chat box today. Before we begin the webinar, I'm going to give you a quick rundown on the Level 3 meeting system. This webinar technology consists of two parts. The audio is provided through a telephone conference line, and the visuals are provided through a web platform. The phone number for the conference line and the link to the web platform were sent to you by email after you registered for the webinar through Level 3. If you have any questions about the technology at any time during this presentation, please type them into the chat box on the left-hand side of your screen. If you are in full screen, please note that you may need to minimize your screen in order to see the chat box. You can also email me at Mariel, that's MARIEL @onf.org, and I will work with you to resolve technical issues as soon as possible. If you have topic-related questions during the presentation, please type them into the chat box. During the Q&A, questions will be read aloud to the group. If you would prefer to ask your questions over the phone, we will provide you with the instructions to unmute your line during the Q&A. This webinar is being recorded, and a YouTube link will be sent to all participants in about 1 week along with the presentation slides. I would now like to introduce our presenter, Mariana Brusoni. Dr. Mariana Brusoni is a developmental psychologist and associate professor in the Department of Pediatrics and the School of Population and Public Health at the University of British Columbia. She is an investigator with the British Columbia Children's Hospital Research Institute and the British Columbia Injury Research and Prevention Unit. Mariana investigates child injury prevention and children's risky play. She is leading research to develop an index of playability of the built environment for children aged 10 to 13 years, and research to develop and test a tool to reframe parents' risk perceptions related to outdoor play. More details are available at www.brusonilab.ca. And without further ado, I'm going to ask Dr. Mariana Brusoni to take it away, and I'll be unmuting you right now.
Thank you, Mariel. And thanks, everyone, for joining us today. I see the long list of people, and I'm so impressed that people have put time aside to be here, and honored to be the first presenter in this webinar series. And I ideally make my presentations interactive. It's a little harder with a webinar, but we'll see what we can do as we go along. But just to give you a little bit more background on me, beyond what Mariel already said, as she mentioned, I'm an injury prevention researcher. I've been doing injury prevention research since 2001. And where this particular research comes from, which might be a bit counterintuitive to a lot of people, is it was really my understanding that the way that injury prevention approached risk was as something negative, as something to be avoided at all costs, like the equivalent of a danger or a hazard. And yet, as a developmental psychologist, when I was looking at the research around child development and risks and how important those are, there seemed to be a disconnect between what we were telling people in injury prevention, what the research showed in developmental psychology and even in physical activity in other areas, as well as my own approach to parenting my own children, of which one you can see on screen right now. This is my son, who's now 10 years old. So just as a rough outline of what we'll be covering today, really we'll be talking about the what, why, and how of risky play. So what is it? Why is it important? And how do we make change to accommodate for this really important kind of play for children? But before we go anywhere else, where I think we all need to begin is back in our own childhood. So I just want you to reflect right now a little bit on what was your own childhood like. And I want you to think about what your favorite thing to do was, and really take yourself back there. So what were you doing? Who were you with? Where were you? And really just think about the sights and the smells and the sounds that you experienced in that childhood memory. So now I just want to ask you a couple of questions about that. So first of all, if you could fill out the poll, where was your favorite place to play? So in this memory, were you inside or were you outside? Oh boy. So this is really quite interesting and striking that we have the vast, vast, vast majority of you were outside. And I just want you to think about why outside seemed to be your favorite place to be, and we'll come back to that in a moment. Okay, I want to ask you another question about your childhood memory. Were you taking risks while you were in that favorite place? Okay, let's have a look at the results. So some really interesting results here. So you clearly, a lot of you clearly remember, that was an important part of your own favorite play memory. Okay, one more question. Were you supervised? Okay. So this is really interesting as well. The vast, vast majority of you were not actually supervised. So if we reflect on what this kind of play was like, it's interesting to think about if we ask the same questions of kids today, and what is childhood like now, and what do you think that children would say? Would they have similar memories to the ones that you remember in your favorite childhood memory? Okay. So what we're seeing here is that a lot of you think that, in fact, the kind of play that kids are doing now is quite different. Now, there are still some kids, by the looks of it, who are experiencing the same kinds of activities that you remember as a child. But for most of you, you think that it's really changed for kids. Well, and I think these results reflect what we're seeing in the research, that some kids are experiencing the kinds of play memories that we had. But unfortunately, what we're seeing for the vast majority of children is a really big difference and change in how they're playing. So a move towards more indoor, screen-based, and sedentary and supervised activities. And so, why should we care about that? In injury prevention, perhaps we should really think that this is a good thing, that it can actually keep kids safe. But in fact, that might not actually be the case. And it also has some very important implications for other aspects of children's health and well-being. So, this is quite a striking graph that I find, because it's 4 generations of one family and their roaming range. So the 8-year-olds of these families, how far were they allowed to go? And so the big blob you see right in the middle that kind of dominates it was great-granddad. When he was 8 years old in 1919, he could go 6 miles. And this was in, I'm trying to remember where this was. It's Sheffield, that's right. But when you see with his son in 1950, he was allowed to go 1 mile. And then in 1979, the daughter, when she was 8 years old, was allowed to go half a mile to the swimming pool. And her son today is allowed to go to the end of his street. And in fact, with Canadian children, what we're seeing is an 8-year-old is actually quite lucky to even get out of his garden gate. And so what implications could there be for this kind of change in children's activities and play? Well, we're already seeing physical manifestation of children's bodies and changes. And unfortunately, sorry, this was supposed to be animated, and I forgot that this flattens. But essentially, there was a research that compared children's body and fitness level from 1981 to 2009. And what they found was the Canadian children are getting taller and, not surprisingly, heavier, but they're also getting fatter, rounder, weaker, less flexible, and less aerobically fit than they were in 1981. So we're already seeing implications for children's bodies. And there's other research also to show or to suggest that there's implications even for their eyesight, their gut microbiomes, their mental health and anxiety, and all sorts of other possible sequelae resulting from their disconnection with the outdoors and play and nature. Now let's talk about risky play specifically for a moment. So when we look at the academic literature, it's this: thrilling and exciting forms of play involving uncertainty and the chance of physical injury. And when you talk to kids, and this is based on research done by Ellen Sandseter in Norway, who did her PhD thesis on this with 3 to 5-year-old kids. And what she found was they said things like, it's thrilling, but I get a bit scared, and scary and funny, and it tickles in my tummy. And maybe in the play memories that you had at the beginning of this talk, you remember this kind of feeling. And hopefully you're still experiencing these kinds of opportunities as an adult. I want to return specifically to this definition because all of these elements are important. So it's thrilling and exciting forms of play. And how it's thrilling and exciting is really that the child is pushing themselves, they're exploring their limits, and they're playing with uncertainty. So they don't know what's going to happen. It's a science experiment with the world and with their body and with what they like to do and so on. If they knew what was going to happen, then it wouldn't be thrilling or exciting. Now, the problem with uncertainty is that adults hate uncertainty, particularly adults who are supervising children. And so we have a really hard time with that concept and with understanding how to become comfortable with it. And the chance of physical injury, yes, they're being physically active. There will be a chance of physical injury. And a bit later on, I'll talk about what that likelihood is when we look at the injury statistics. So Ellen Sandseter has identified 6 different kinds of risky play. So play at speed, so like running really fast, a game of chase. Play at height, for example, climbing trees. Play with dangerous tools, like where they're building a fort or that sort of thing. Play near dangerous elements like fire or water or cliffs. Rough and tumble play, like play fighting. And play where there's a chance of getting lost. So where the child isn't supervised, can wander with them, with their friends or on their own in their community. Or in the case of younger children, for example, they're in a play space, but they feel like they can hide behind bushes and so on. And what risky play looks like is really quite different for different kids. So you can have a child who, 2 children who are exact same age and developmental stage, and yet they have different comfort levels and desires for risk. So one will, say, climb to the bottom branch of the tree, and one wants to go straight to the top. And so it's not for us to decide what is risky or what is not. It really has to be the child who's figuring that out for themselves. And it's our role to provide them the venue, and the support, the physical and the psychological space to be able to do that. Now, I just want to touch on what risky play is not. It's not about neglect, right? So it is about figuring out how best to support those children in that play. It's not about recklessness and promoting hazards for the sake of hazards, or about pushing children beyond their abilities or interests. Like, for example, you can go higher, come on, you should try it, come on. So it's really about giving the child the space to be able to figure it out for themselves. And our role, for those of you who are familiar with Vygotsky's idea of zone of proximal development, it's about providing, the support for them to be able to realize what they can do, but not pushing them beyond that. Sometimes it's helpful to think about, say, the difference between a hazard and a risk in trying to get a handle on this. And, and so I'm not thrilled with this, but it's a way of explaining it. So a hazard would be, for example, something that a child wouldn't be able to identify for themselves or wouldn't have the capability of dealing with for themselves. So, for example, like broken equipment or needles on a playground, or for example, there's thorns on a bush that's at eye level for little preschoolers, so you can just cut those back a bit. In contrast, a risk is something that the child can make a decision for themselves whether they want to engage in that activity or not. And so what we should move towards in injury prevention is, rather than an aim of keeping kids as safe as necessary or safe as possible, what we should do is actually just keep them as safe as necessary. So I just want to touch a little bit on the benefits of outdoor risky play. And so for those of you, that are interested in this particular picture, this is a picture from Anji Play, ANJI Play. And I'd encourage you to go and look at their website and so on. This is kids who have decided, they have put this equipment together themselves. They've decided where things go, and they've decided where to put the mats and how to engage with that space. It's a really interesting concept. And I think it shows quite well what children are capable of. But so taking you back to your favorite childhood memory, I think that a lot of what I'm about to say is actually going to be intuitive for you if you think about how you were playing and why you liked it so much. So we know, for example, with the literature that when children are outside, they move more, sit less, and play longer. And so if you think about what you liked about being outside, it was probably the freedom to engage in the big movements, to be able to run around, to chase your friends, to have that freedom to yell or do whatever it is that you wanted to do. And those are very engaging for kids and also promote physical activity. So having loose parts to play with is really good for socio-emotional development, reducing bullying, and providing higher levels of happiness. So when I talk about loose parts, I mean things like sticks or stones or mud or sand or crates or tarps or those sorts of things. These are parts that children can grab and move around and mold to their imagination. This is in contrast to typical playgrounds where you have a piece of fixed equipment that can't be manipulated or moved. And so it only has as much kind of flexibility as a piece of fixed equipment can have. And so the research has found that when you give kids this flexibility to move these parts around, they really can engage in their imagination. They learn how to play with each other and negotiate the rules, and so it's not an adult telling them how to play or what their goal is or what the steps to attain that goal. They're figuring that all out for themselves and with each other. And because they're interested and engaged, they're less likely to engage in antisocial behavior and more likely to engage in pro-social behavior. Access to nature is really important in being outside. So we talked about loose parts and how they can be manipulated. So that aspect of nature, how it changes all the time, how kids can mold it to promote challenge is really important. Nature is also a stress buffer. So, there's lots of evidence. It's getting stronger by the day to show that people outside in nature have reduction in their stress, their attention is restored, they can manage their emotions better, it has influence on their mental health and well-being. And I think also importantly in this age when we're really concerned about the future of our planet, early exposure to nature and positive experiences with nature are really crucial to promoting environmental awareness and understanding why nature is so important and why we need to be stewards of nature. Access to the outdoors is really important as well. So things like Vitamin D, for example, we live in a northern climate, and we need access to sunlight, and so being outside is really important for us. Myopia, so that's short-sightedness, and so in fact, new research is finding that it's going up and up and up with different generations. In fact, in parts of Asia, the levels are at 90+% of children who have myopia. And what they're finding is actually that it's a lack of exposure to a certain dimension of light that hits the retina that helps with reducing the likelihood of myopia. Spatial working memory is impacted by being outside and being able to engage in these complex environments, because outside is broad, it's big. And so as kids are trying to navigate those environments, they really are able to figure out how these different parts fit together, and that really helps expand their spatial working memory. Outdoor play promotes curiosity, exploration, learning, all of which are associated with later academic success. So you can imagine that when you have these kind of rich play environments, that kids are going to want to engage with them. Unlike your typical play environment that we see on many Canadian playgrounds, heavily supervised as well, where kids aren't really allowed to engage in the way that they want, and so they get bored quickly. There is no curiosity. They sit and look at screens instead. We talked about physical activity in general, but what's interesting too is with executive functioning. So executive functioning, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is really important and crucial to children's futures. So it's basically cognitive processes. How kids, for example, decide where to direct their attention, how they decide which goals they have and the steps they need to attain those goals, and those sorts of things. And so there's a lot of research now pushing towards how can we develop children's executive functioning skills. And one of the interesting new findings is that physical activity is really important, but not just any kind of physical activity. It has to be in the context of complexity, novelty, and diversity. And really, when you have kind of a rich outdoor play environment, it's an ideal place for that, those things to synergize and help children in their development of executive functioning. So I want to talk a little bit now about the injury statistics. So are we overdoing things? Are we too worried in injury prevention about children's safety? So just a quick poll again for everybody. What are our biggest fears, do you think, in terms of letting kids out to play and take risks? And you can choose as many as you like. And so, the kinds of answers that you're putting here are strongly reflected in our work with parents. Stranger danger is an overwhelming fear, as is traffic. And injuries, not just, obviously the serious injuries that can lead to lifelong consequences, but sometimes parents are even worried about minor bumps and bruises. And then what we're seeing too is an academization of time, such that play is seen as a waste of time when there's so many other ways we need to develop children's, their cognitive development and all of that. And so time isn't made for play. So let's talk about the stats around the injuries and strangers for a moment. So there's not actually regular statistics kept on kidnappings because they are so rare, actually. And so the last time kind of a comprehensive review of data across Canada was done was in 2003, where they looked at 2001, 2002 data and found that across that time that there was one case of true stranger abduction. So, if you look at the rate of that, it's about 1 in 14 million. And Warwick Carnes has estimated that you would have to leave your child unattended for 200,000 years in order to, log enough time to have them abducted by a stranger. And even then, you'd be likely to get them back. So it's the likelihood of stranger abduction is just so minimal that, and yet it has such a big impact on parents' decision-making and perceptions that it's really important to not only point out how unlikely it is, but point out the harm that can be done by these kind of really protective behaviors that parents do in order to, not leave their child unsupervised and at any time. Okay, so let's talk about injuries. So here's the unintentional injury deaths for 0 to 19-year-olds from 1950 to 2009. And so what you see is the blue is males and the red is females. And we've seen this kind of gender difference among males and females always. So what you might notice is that the rates are going way down. And in fact, also thankfully, we're seeing less of a gender difference as well. Now, I've often been asked about this slide. Okay, well, maybe it means that our approach to protection and supervision is working, and that, in fact, this slide is all about how we should continue doing that. Well, if you look at the big kind of drops, you see around the 70s and, 1973-ish, that there was, the start of a big drop in injury prevention, or in injury, sorry. And what happened here, for those of you who might be familiar with the statistics, is if you think about what happened in the 70s, one of the important factors was seatbelts. So seatbelts were mandated to come into cars, I think in 72. And then between like 73, I think, and 1990, the Canadian provinces across Canada were passing seatbelt laws. And so when you log those changes, as well as increase in laws around drunk driving, the greater ability of things like anti-lock brakes and airbags and car safety seats and so on, that what you find is that the motor vehicle crashes have always been, the leading cause of death for kids. And they still are, but the big gains we're seeing here are really as a result of motor vehicle safety, more than they kind of dwarf everything else. So let's look a little closer at the injury death statistics, and I'll be sharing, these are BC data, which you can actually access for yourselves on the BC Injury Research and Prevention Unit website, where there's a tool where you can manipulate the data to figure out, different ages and types of injuries and so on. But these are the deaths for 1 year, our most recent available year, for children aged 1 to 14. And so the number you see is the number of deaths. So there were 5 transport deaths. And in brackets, you see the rate. And when you see the star, that means that it's a number less than 5, and so it can't be released because of privacy concerns. And so what you might notice with the leading causes of death here is that, as I mentioned, cars are at the top, but that you don't see play. So play doesn't cause death, or at least is extremely, extremely rare. So just to give you a better sense of that, I looked at the statistics across Canada for falls from play equipment for years 2007 to 2013, which was what was available on the Statistics Canada website, and falls from trees for 2000 to 2013. So what we have here is across those 7 years, there was 1 death across the entire country. So if you add, there's about 7 million kids in Canada. So if you 7 million kids times 7 years, the rate is 1 in 49 million. It is infinitesimally tiny. And there were 0 deaths from falls from trees across 14 years. So to my mind, if I think about this from an injury epidemiology perspective, this is not a type of injury that we should worry about. We should be worried about cars and suicides, which are really the creeping killers in this. Okay, so maybe play is resulting in children ending up in hospital. So here's the hospital statistics for the fiscal year 2013-14, again for BC. And so as many of you know, you're on the falls webinar, is that falls are the leading cause of injury-related hospitalization regardless of your age group. And so we see, not surprisingly, the same pattern here. And this is where we might start to see play creeping in. So let's look a little bit deeper at the falls statistics. So here's what we have. We have falls involving play equipment as by far the leading cause of fall-related hospitalizations here. So, at first blush, what you see here is that a child a day in BC is ending up in hospital due to a fall from play equipment. And if you're just looking at these numbers, you might think we need to get rid of play equipment, or we need to do even more to make them safer. But what's missing here is an understanding of the amount of time that children are spending on, so the injury exposure time, as well as the kinds of injuries that we're seeing. So I've exploded out the injuries, and what you can see here is that 89% of these, or 90% of these, are fractures. Now, fractures are not fun, obviously. But, I work at BC Children's Hospital. I talk to my orthopedic colleagues all the time. And even they who see, some of the worst cases, think that it's way better to have children outside playing, getting physically active, and with fractures that for the most part can easily be fixed and aren't going to result in long-term repercussions. And so when we look at these data, what we see is that even the likelihood of serious injury are it's very, very low. And in terms of exposure data, as I mentioned, we don't know how much time kids spent on playgrounds, so that 365 of them on average end up in hospital. But we do know that in BC there's approximately 634,000 kids. And so you can imagine that those kids are spending a lot of time on playgrounds. And we're only seeing 365 injuries ending up in hospital a year. To my mind, that is quite compelling. And just to touch on injuries by exposure time, we don't have these data, but there has been research done here and there. And in fact, there was a systematic review done where they looked across medically treated injuries that, studies that had exposure time for active commuting, so like walking or cycling to school, sports participation, and leisure time, which is basically play. And so, when I ask people in person, what do you think caused the most number of injuries? They usually say sports. Then when I ask them, what do you think caused the most likelihood of injury when you account for exposure? They usually say active commuting. So here's what actually happened. What we find is that while play actually had the highest number of injuries, and you can see from the previous stats why, we have a large number of kids and they're mostly playing. So they're logging up a lot of injury time or injuries. But when you account for the time spent in that injury, it's actually among the safest activities. And so sports comes out on top as the one that leads to the most medically treated injuries. And so if we try and translate this 0.15 to 0.17 per thousand hours, what that means is essentially that a child would need to play 3 hours a day for about 10 years. And it's before they logged enough time to actually get injured, right? And when we talk about medically treated injuries, across these reviews, they range from, for example, going to the school principal's office to get an ice pack to actually ending up having to go to hospital. And so what we see here is even if, they get an injury, it's very likely to be minor. So I hope that gives you a sense of how, in many ways we are overreacting to the dangers of play and over controlling children's access to this kind of activity. So I think also it's important to think about that we have a paradox here, and that is that keeping kids safe means letting them take risks. And so what we're finding is that kids need those science experiments with their body and with the world to figure out how it all works, what they're comfortable with, how their body moves, in order to figure out how to develop their risk management skills to keep themselves safe. If they have an adult who's telling them things like, not any higher, get down, stop, not there, what they're hearing is the world is a dangerous place. I can't take care of myself, and I'm not competent to do that. I need an adult to tell me what to do. And so I should just sit around and wait for that instruction. So you can imagine the impact that has on their mental health and well-being and self-esteem, let alone their development of risk management skills. So how do we make things better? Well, there's 3 key elements to outdoor and risky play supportive environments. The children need the time to be able to play, they need the space to do it in, and they need the freedom to be able to play the way they want to play. So just to give you some examples of important ways to affect this kind of change. So for time, it really is, a concerted effort by everyone involved. But for example, with schools, they could make sure that they mandate unstructured, independent, freely chosen playtime. So like a daily outdoor recess or an early childhood center that's making sure the kids that get outside every day, regardless of the weather. In terms of space, it's important that this space be high quality and diverse. So not the wasteland that you often see on children's play spaces. So one of the easiest ways to do this is to have loose parts, as I mentioned, things that children can manipulate so that they can move them around to shape their play. With respect to freedom, the biggest barrier there is us, the adults, and our attitude. And so, I'm going to share some different tools, including ours, in terms of how you reframe adult perceptions of risk. But one of the important things, for example, is for an organization, a municipality, a school, an early childhood center, a community health center, to have a policy around play, the importance of play, and that be embedded throughout the organization. And so this might seem overwhelming, but there's a lot of tools that I'm about to share with you that are actually there to help you and others put these kinds of things in place. So before I get to those, I just want to give you kind of go back and give an overview of what we've covered. So I hope that you've realized that children need regular and repeated opportunities for outdoor play with its risk. So we can't take risks away from play, nor should we want to. Life is full of risks and uncertainty. And these bring, yes, the greatest challenges that we will experience, and also the greatest joys. Children, when they hit adulthood, aren't all of a sudden going to have the skills to deal with life and its risks, and uncertainty. These skills need to be built up over time. To provide a supportive play environment, we need time, we need space, and we need freedom. And what's really necessary is collective action and cooperation so that we're all working together to make this a reality. So I just want you to reflect right now on, is there anything that you want to change? I want you to think about what one thing would you like to do differently? And I want you to reflect on how you will do it and whose help you will need. Now, don't set yourself up a goal that seems overwhelming. I want you to start with something simple, something attainable that can start you on this journey. So, for example, with parents, I sometimes tell them, maybe just use the 17-second rule. So next time you're tempted to say, be careful, stop, get down, count to 17. That's it, before you open your mouth. And that will give you time to see how the child reacts, the kinds of things that they're capable of doing, and give you time to really see, is this really that dangerous? Do I need to stop this play? So in terms of resources, I would encourage you to go have a look at our lab website. There's a resource page on there where I've posted most of, I think everything actually that I'm about to cover with you, as well as other tools. If you didn't have a chance, The Nature of Things put out an episode on the power of play in January that was really nicely done. And it's not just because I was in it, of course, that helps. But, they did a really nice arc across different research showing why it's important, including risk and risk-taking. I talked about our risk reframing tool for parents. So that's available at outsideplay.ca. And it basically takes parents through 3 chapters of self-reflection exercises and some interactive videos like Choose Your Own Adventure before they finally end up in creating their action plan. And so we just finished the randomized control trial and actually find that it works. And so I'd encourage you to let any parents that you deal with, or have a look at it for yourself, see if you like it, and then get it out there. A lot of what I've talked about today and the research links are covered in this blog that I wrote, Why Kids Need Risk, Fear, and Excitement in Play. So if you want kind of a nice, easy, user-friendly summary, then you can go to that. One of the most important tools that has come out, it came out just last month, was the Canadian Public Health Association put out their Project Play tools. And this is a toolkit with some amazing resources in it. So they have infographics, for example, showing why play is so important, summarizing very easily some of the research, busting some of the myths around injuries, and so on. So really helpful for advocacy, for information for parents or for others that you're wanting to talk to. They have a list of promising practices, so different projects across the country that have tried different approaches, and so you can get a sense of kind of what others have done and how they've approached this in a variety of different sectors. They have research summaries, so nice, easy look over the research supporting the importance of this. They have decision-making tools. So these are things like I talked about the importance of developing a play charter. They have a tool on how to do that. They have a tool on the duty of care that is required for play providers. They have another tool on loose parts play and how to put that into place, and several other great things in there. And then they have a position paper around the play, why it's so important, and the wicked problem of play, and how you approach it from a public health perspective. So I want to open it up at this point for questions and also to share my contact information. For any of you, feel free to please get in touch. It's very useful for me to hear from you so that I can, so that my research can reflect the kinds of issues that you have who are actually able to make change. So I'll stop there and see if we have any questions.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Dr. Mariana Busoni, for that presentation and for sharing all of your knowledge on this topic. It was very interesting, and I'm seeing a lot of the comments that were left in the chat box agreeing that it's a very, very interesting topic. I don't think we've received any questions in the chat box yet, but I will open it up to all of the webinar participants. Please type your questions into the chat box. You should be able to see it on the left-hand side of your screen. I'm also going to forward the slide here to provide instructions on how people can unmute their line. So if you would like to ask your question directly to Dr. Mariana Busoni, you can press *7 on your phone to unmute. We will just ask you to press *6 to remute your line once you finish asking your questions so that we don't receive any background noise or potential feedback. So one question that's come in from Janice Simmons. Our biggest challenge are the parents. They don't want their child to participate in risky play. How do we get them to understand the benefits other than the resource you just shared?
Well, frankly, the resources I just shared do have some wonderful benefits. So I would recommend highly that you go to the CPHA tool and look at the infographics, because they are very easy kind of summaries of the importance of play. But one of the things that I have found actually very effective is what I did with you at the very beginning, which is to take you back to your early play memories, right? And if you get people to think about that experience, then it helps them, first of all, remember what it's like to be a child and how important these experiences are. And second of all, reflect on how these experiences influence them. So have a look at the CPHA toolkit and have a look also at our risk reframing tool, because it was designed with parents in mind to kind of shift their perceptions.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Mariana, for answering that question. We do have a few more that have come into the chat box. So Kelsey Nichols asks, what is the best way to approach risky play with parents who have experienced trauma? We are a trauma-informed agency.
Right, and that's a great question. And the other question that's relevant too is, for example, with vulnerable, deprived populations, indigenous populations, groups like that have that can have these higher rates of trauma as well. And so I think we need to do, frankly, more research. But there were some cases where parents we talked to had their own childhood experience of trauma that was influencing their approach and can make them quite concerned about their child's safety. So, I mean, really, these people do really need the support and the therapy to be able to help overcome that trauma. But you can use some of the same ideas that we've just been sharing in terms of most people do have these wonderfully rich childhood memories, about at least one or two really beautiful memories about outdoor play. And so you can use those to really bring out kind of that feeling of fun and exhilaration and joy that childhood should be about and that is so crucial, and let them kind of think about that in the context of their child and their children's lives. But I think we need to do more research, and I think we need to really work with different cultural groups and populations to get a better handle on this.
Wonderful, thank you. There are quite a few more questions coming into the chat box, but we do still have 10 minutes, so hopefully we can get through them all. Caroline has asked, may we have a copy of the slides, and I can answer that question. Yes, you will be receiving a PDF copy of these slides within 1 week of the presentation. This webinar is also being recorded and will be made available on YouTube. Fatima has asked, thanks for the presentation. I was wondering what the ratios are for the BC statistics in comparison to the Canadian statistics.
Yeah, so they're similar. So I use BC statistics because I can drill down those statistics further than I can with other data, because we have access to the data with the Injury Research and Prevention Unit. But the ratios are very similar across the country. And in fact, you can look at the Parachute Canada website. They have some nice summaries of statistics in different areas.
Perfect, thank you. Munira has asked, has there been a webinar on the nature deficit disorder or any other materials?
So I would highly recommend the Children's Nature Network in the U.S. has some wonderful materials on there. So it was started by Richard Louv, he of the Last Child in the Woods fame. He wrote that book. But since then, it's really expanded, and they have wonderful links to research there. They have a weekly newsletter that is full of material. So I would encourage you to look there for more information. There's also one of the infographics on the CPHA website includes a discussion about nature.
Great, thank you. Caroline McIntosh asks, can you comment on risky play and laws that do not permit children to be left alone until 11 years old?
Yeah, this is a great question. Sorry, all of them are great questions, but this one in particular is, I have a PhD student in social work who is currently looking at this very question. And so there are, the provinces actually have different legislative contexts. So in fact, in BC, for example, there is no law saying the age at which a child can be left alone. But in Ontario, there's a law that says something like 16. It is 16. What I don't understand is how that could possibly be the case, because it seems insane that a child who is capable of driving, is the first time they're allowed to be left alone. My sense of when I've talked to people in Ontario is that it's not applied that way. So that's something we need to get a bigger handle on. But what we want to understand is, like, for example, there was a case in BC a couple of years ago where a dad with 5 kids, they were taking the bus. The oldest kid was 11. The youngest was 7, and social services got involved because they got a call, and he was investigated and told that the oldest child had to be at least 12 before they could act as like a babysitter, essentially, for the other kids. And in that case, they cited a BC Supreme Court ruling about a couple who was in dispute over their child, and the judge had ruled in that case that in that particular case, the child should be 12 before they're left alone at home. The problem is that ruling, which applied in only that specific case and, indoors after school kind of situation, was applied, to this when it was actually a whole different kettle of fish. So he's actually launched a lawsuit around that. I haven't gotten the latest information on that. Excuse me. But the long and the short of it is there's work in Manitoba to counteract some of this, and there's work across the country to think about how this applies. But my PhD student is interested in kind of developing a toolkit for social workers. So when they get a call, how do they distinguish the difference between what is truly supervisory neglect and what's just kids trying to walk to school?
Perfect, thank you. Do you have any advice or resources to advocate with municipalities or schools to create outdoor spaces with loose parts? Do natural playgrounds provide the same benefit?
Yes. Again, I would point you to the CPHA toolkit for the decision-making tools. Has a loose part a loose part tool. So it tells you how should you store loose parts, how do you develop a policy for who should inspect them, who brings them in, brings them out, all of those logistics are nicely covered in that tool. And in the promising practices, there is one of those practices is the City of Calgary and their approach to pop-up playgrounds and loose parts and so on. And then in terms of nature playgrounds, we also have a website called outdoorplaybook.ca. which is for schools trying to develop naturalized playgrounds. So there's a lot of resources there on what that should look like and some of the guidelines around developing naturalized playgrounds and so on.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mariana. Darren Barkhouse also comments, a child can be alone at age 10 in Ontario and responsible for another child at age 12. So just reinforcing, I think, the information that you have provided.
Great. Thank you.
Yolanda has asked, what advice would you give to inner city caregivers or parents who are constantly watching over their shoulders due to the nature of their surroundings?
Yeah, and that's a great question, and it relates somewhat to the trauma question earlier. I want to bring up kind of the context of Indigenous parents too. So what we're seeing is that Indigenous parents are more likely to be investigated or targeted for social work related issues than other parents. And even though they only represent 10% of kids, they're 50% of the kids in care. And so Indigenous parents have very good reason to be wary about, for example, their kids getting injured and ending up, in a hospital with an injury, and then that bringing up all sorts of questions on, why is your child injured and what really happened and that sort of thing. And so that's something that we as a culture need to work on really hard. And then with respect to, if there's actual hazards in the environment, I think this also relates to, parents have to make a decision about what's appropriate in their particular context. So one of the questions I'm often asked is at what time or what age is it okay for kids to walk to school? And I say there is no time or age that you can say it wouldn't be appropriate, because you could have a child, for example, that has to cross a simple residential street to get to school, and they can do that at a much younger age, and there's few hazards, few cars, etc. You could have a child who has to navigate quite a complex environment. Maybe there's a big highway or train tracks or whatever, and they're going to need to have more experience. And it's also, I don't want parents to think that once my child hits a certain age, they're ready for whatever the environment throws at them. So, these are skills that need to be built up over time. And so it's really important for parents to kind of have that freedom to be able to consider their environmental consequences. What is their environment like, and how can they actually navigate that to allow their kids to have these opportunities.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mariana. I just want to let people know, please, if you keep having questions or if questions keep arising, please continue to input them in the chat box. Any unanswered questions we can send to Mariana, and she can reach out to you individually or create a little questions and answers document with some responses. Tracy has asked, building on the natural playground question, we face resistance from maintenance of the space. Any good evidence that may speak to maintenance requirements?
Okay, so this is one of the kind of big barriers we see in schools, for example. Like the maintenance workers say, I want basically everything paved so that I don't have to maintain it. And so they can often be the biggest barriers. And so it's ironic because natural playgrounds are generally can be quite a bit less expensive than your typical playgrounds. Play equipment is actually extremely expensive. But then you have the ongoing maintenance costs. But you have lots of examples of schools and other municipalities that have really made a success of this. For example, where a community garden in a school becomes the resource of the entire community. And so in summertime, there is dedicated volunteers who come and make sure to maintain it and so on. In terms of kind of loose parts, as I mentioned, there's the loose parts toolkit, which provides some really great resources around how do you manage loose parts. So I would highly recommend you look at that, and that relates to maintenance and so on. So it is possible. There needs to be some pushback because often people don't do things assuming that say their risk manager or their maintenance or whatever or their licensing officer will say no without even trying. And so often that person won't say no, or if they do, it's also like, okay, why? Give me some good reasons. And are we making decisions around what kids should be allowed to do based on our own fears and anxieties and annoyances? Or are we putting children at the center of this decision making?
Wonderful. Thank you, Mariana. Nazi is asking, kids are already having 3 outdoor play sessions / recess. When they come back home, they are already very tired. In this situation, how can a parent be motivated to take them outdoors?
Well, so it's also, it depends on the age and where you're at, but part of it is that the parent shouldn't need to take them outdoors. It's about letting them go out and explore on their own. And I totally understand that parents are tired and so on. But one of the things to remember is that time outdoors and in nature is restorative for adults too. And so we can think about this as really for our own health as well.
Perfect, thank you. And two, I guess, more logistical questions from Sylvie and Sean. They're asking, first of all, they're thanking you for a wonderful presentation and they're admiring your slides. Do they have permission to share a couple of your slides as long as they are referenced and credited appropriately, Mariana?
So most of the slides are okay to share. I'll just mention that I don't actually have the rights to all of these pictures, so I can send you another slide that doesn't have these pictures on it. Everything else, I'm just flipping through. Everything else, you're fine to share.
Wonderful, thank you. Unfortunately, it is just after 1, and I see some people signing off. So we're going to close out the webinar, and if there are any other questions, please feel free to contact myself or Dr. Mariana. I'm just going to pull up her contact slide
Let
here
me just,
one last time.
Yes, thank you.
So thank you so much, Dr. Mariana Brusini, for presenting for us at our first ever Loop Junior webinar. There's been so much positive feedback in the chat box about this presentation, and it's going to be a great start, I think, to our webinar series. I would also like to thank the participants today for joining us, engaging in a great discussion, and we got so many questions. So I'm going to welcome everybody to continue their discussions on Loop Junior. If you're not yet a member, registration is free, and you can join us at www.jr.fallsloop.com. Please don't close this window just yet. Wait until you have been redirected to the next screen where a brief evaluation survey will launch in your browser. We appreciate if you could provide us feedback so that we can continue to offer high-quality webinars, and please also let us know what webinar topics you're interested in. As I mentioned, this is the first webinar that we have offered through Loop Junior, so we are taking topic suggestions so that we can continue to offer webinars throughout the year. Thank you so much, everybody, and have a wonderful day. See you next time.
Thanks. Bye.